I'm with Alford, Joe Robinson. He recently released a new edition of Think Outside the Cell, an entrepreneur's guide for the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. How you doing today?
I'm good, good. Thanks, Ryan, for inviting me on the show.
Oh man, most definitely. Like, like I was telling you, like before we started recording, I learned about you on Black News, which is a wonderful site. Like, they feature some of the best Black authors. And I was reading about your story, and
Mhm.
I guess you like grew up in East New York, Brooklyn. What was that experience?
Yep, yep, yeah. It was no joke. It was very rough. So this is in the 80s. In the 80s during my teen years, and this was the beginning of the crack era, even without the crack era, it was already a tough neighborhood, poverty-stricken neighborhood. Crack, the introduction, so to speak, of crack just made things worse. So it was very, as you can imagine, very violent, very, meaning the neighborhood. Family life was difficult because I'll just put it out there because my mom succumbed to addiction during this time, and several of her siblings, my uncles and aunts, several of them. So like the family structure began to fall apart. So it was extremely tough. And I went from going to school every day and being a good student to not going to school and then to eventually dropping out and getting in trouble with the law. So it was a very tough time.
So you got in trouble in the law. How old were you when you got in trouble for the first time?
So the first time I was 16, I was 16 years old, so very young. I was in high school. I was in the 10th grade, I believe. And prior to that, like I said, I was a A student. My goal was to be a pilot. My father was actually a pilot. And so I didn't grow up with my father, but he still had some impact on me. And so yeah, so at 16 though, when I learned of my mom's addiction in 1985, actually. So within a year, right, in less than a year, I began to start skipping school, hanging out with my friends, and then started committing crimes with them. And I feel terrible about it now as a much older person. And but yeah, yeah. So it all started when I was about 16. So that was in 1986. I was born in 1970.
So, you like were committing crimes at like 16, like I guess like with your friends, like what was some of the stuff you guys were getting into?
So at that age, or stage, I should say, of my life, it was robberies. So it was like, we lived in Brooklyn, so most of the time we would go to Manhattan,
Yeah.
where I live now, ironically enough. And it would usually be like one person, like for example, one person might like just hold some, and I'm not minimizing it at all, but basically it would be what they call acting in concert. So normally I would like I wouldn't rob somebody on my own. I would never, do that. So it would be me and maybe two or three other people, and one person might like hold the person like kind of like in a bear hug, so to speak, and while the other person goes through their pockets and then runs off with their stuff. Again, I feel terrible about it now. But yeah, it was that type of stuff. No like weapons or anything like that, but still a robbery, taking their property. And we would I would personally use the money for back then. It was, in addition to it being a crack era, and all that, it was also, the whole thing of fashion was a big thing. And I guess that it's like that for all teenagers. But in the 80s, during the Reagan administration, everything was about money and making money and all this stuff. Not illegally, but money, just making money. And so as a teenager, at the time, felt a lot of pressure to um you know, basically looked like I had money, right? So I would buy stuff, name brand stuff. So when I would, commit crimes with friends, I would then take the money to then buy clothes, mostly. I mean, that's what I did, uh, to look like I had money, essentially. So it was that kind of cycle. And so, we just kept doing it. So I didn't do it like every day, but did it often enough. And then in January of 1987. So I was 16 going on 17. My birthday is in April. I got arrested, right? Well, actually, in December of 86, I got arrested for robbery. They could not, the police, so I was arrested, taken to like central booking in downtown Brooklyn. And the uh, police couldn't find the victim. I guess the person just got up and walked away or whatever, never reported it. And so they let me go. Like early in the middle of the morning, just let me go. I was sleeping. I thought I was going to jail. And then they said, "Oh, you're free to go." I'm like, "I am." I thought it was a dream, but it wasn't. They let me go. Uh, Went home. Obviously, my mom by then had begun abusing drugs, so she wasn't around a lot. So we were living with our grandmother. So, my grandmother was concerned, like, where were you? And, so I had to explain that I was locked up, that I had gotten locked up. And so that was December of 1986. And then the crazy thing is that the next month, so at first, and let me say this, so at first I was shook, how you say, shaken, by the whole experience of being arrested. That was my first time. And so I was afraid and all of that. Meaning I didn't show it, but I felt it. I definitely felt it. And so I said to myself, "Oh, I'm never gonna do that again or do anything to get arrested again." And so my friends, when I got, because I was the only one that got arrested. I think it was like three of us. And so when I got out, and then I saw them the next day, they were like, "Oh, that's kind of messed up that you got arrested. It's too bad or whatever." And then they were ready to like go again. I'm like, "No, I'm done. I'm
Right.
done." But yeah, but a couple of weeks later, I started doing it again. Like the fear and all that other stuff wore off, and I started doing it again, and then got arrested the following month. So I got arrested in January of 1987, um, and this time I was not let go. This time I did end up serving 4 months actually on Rikers Island, which is a really crazy
Yeah,
place.
it's
So.
really tough prison. Like, I've met like a lot of people who have done time at Rikers. I
Mhm,
think I talked to you guy before from Wu Tang, and he was telling me about
mhm,
Rikers and like
mhm.
a couple other people and stuff that I know personally. And like, they've told me like these crazy stories about Rikers,
Crazy.
you
Mhm,
know,
mhm.
just like, the violence. How was it like, especially being young and that being the first time in prison?
Yeah, so it was extremely tough, extremely tough. One of the things I learned quickly was that, I never saw myself, even to this day, but I never saw myself back then as like a tough guy. Like I'm not a soft guy, I'm not a tough guy, if that makes sense, right? And so one of the things I quickly learned at Rikers Island is uh, how I was not tough. Like there was a lot of guys who were tougher, but not just tough, like in the general sense, but who were um, I would say like emotionally like insensitive. Like really
Yeah.
they had no problems hurting people. And
Yeah.
that was a shock to me. Like I was not like that. I'm not like that now. But and many of them were very young. And some of them had been on Rikers Island several times, or even if they hadn't been, they just were hard, hardened by the streets, hardened by their own lives. Again, we're talking the mid 80s. So I would imagine most people's lives who were on the Rikers Islands, their lives were touched by crack in some way, right? Either they sold it, they used it, or family members or friends abused it because it was pervasive. It was all over. It just took over the neighborhood. and so many neighborhoods like ours. But it was so to answer your question, it was extremely tough. And during the 4 months that I was there, got into like four fights. Not You don't have to look for fights; people bring
Right.
it. You
What
know,
were
people
some of
bring.
the issues you would get into fights over?
So one was two comes to mind, but one was over a phone, like using the phone,
Right, I
right?
was I would that's what I would expect. I've heard most people say like usually like the phone there's like
Mhm.
people who like feel the phone is theirs. So
Yeah, yeah. No, exactly. No,
yeah.
people that I don't know how it is now, but
I think
back
it's the same.
then
I've seen videos on the internet recently. It
it's
hasn't
still the same.
changed.
Yeah, it's crazy. But I think the difference now, one slight difference now is I think the way it works now is like you have like everyone who's like detainees have a limited amount of minutes that are free, and then the rest you have to pay for,
Okay.
right? Right. So however that works out, I don't know how much it costs or what the arrangement is, but you have to pay for it, meaning you have to have some money in your account, right? In your inmate accounts or whatever they call it, right? Back then, this is, almost 40 years ago, 30 something years ago. Back then, um, it was free. So, I mean, all calls were free. So you had
Okay.
guys, 16, 17, 9, whatever age, different ages, they would literally, uh, what they would do is it usually would be a crew, right? So not necessarily like a gang, like how they have now, but it would be guys who, stuck together and they'd one after another say, I got this time slot. I have from eight
Right, right.
o'clock to 10 o'clock. This person has this time. And it would be like a relay race,
Yeah.
right? And then, so someone like me, I come in, for example, and I'm like, yo, you want to call your family, right? You want to let them know you're all right. You want to talk that connection to the outside world. You're trying to get money for bail, for lawyers, for all this other stuff. But the guys a lot of guys are insensitive. So I had, a fight over that. Um, and then another time, I mean, it was silly stuff,
Yeah.
to me, like just silly because even though I was 16 going on 17, I think I was pretty mature for my age and I didn't see myself as a quote unquote criminal or anything like that. Ironically enough, even though I was committing crime, I didn't see myself as a criminal. So once I had a fight over a bed. The guy said like I was in a dorm setting, uh, and so the beds are like lined up against the wall, and then there was this middle section for like well, I mean, the beds were just beds, right? But the way it worked then, and I'm sure it does now, is that even though the COs, the correctional officers, are supposed to be in charge,
They're
it's
not.
really it's the incarcerated people who are in charge, right?
Yeah.
And so the COs just come in to bust things up when things get crazy and out of hand, as far as they're concerned, because it's always out of hand. Actually, it's always out of hand, and so. Um, but anyway, so one time this guy came in to the dorm. I had settled in, so to speak, was waiting for my next court date and just, just doing my time, minding my business, right? And a guy comes in, I guess he thought I was soft or whatever, so and approached me and said, um, because the middle section had been unofficially designated for newcomers, right? Like nobody wanted to be in the middle. It's just really stupid stuff. So like having your bed along the wall was almost like a status, right? Like a status symbol. So I had been there for a while, which so I didn't have status, but I was settled in. And so a guy comes in and he's like, and in fact, he said we were going to the mess hall, right? So we had to physically leave the dorm to go to eat, right? To go eat a meal as a group, as a housing unit. And so the guys, I don't know, it just says when we go back, when we come back from eating, we're gonna switch beds. He didn't ask me. He just said we're gonna switch beds. You're gonna take, my bed. I'm gonna take yours. I said no, no, we're not. And he said, okay, we're gonna fight. I said, okay, then we're gonna fight. And that's what we did. And I was, I knew how to fight. Having grown up in East New York, I had my share of fights and stuff. So the good thing was that it was a fair one, as they say. So I didn't get jumped, right? That was very common back then, right? If you didn't know anyone or for whatever other reason, one person they just gang up on you. So that didn't happen. We had a fight. I knew how to fight, and so the CO ended up breaking it up. but and then they kicked the guy out, right? So it wasn't like I had to say anything. They came in and they said, okay, to me, they was like, okay, you've been here for some time, so and you haven't caused any trouble, so I know it's not you. Right. So they moved the other guy to another housing unit. And then ironically enough, a couple of days later, I happened to be in a clinic, right, for just like a regular checkup or something like that. So I see the guy who I had to fight with, uh, and he acted as if we never had a fight, like nothing ever happened. He was like, "Oh, tell my buddy such and such." I said, "What's up?" And blah blah. Blah. I'm like, this place in my mind, I'm like, this place is crazy. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. So it was stuff like that. I I will say on that note that I consider myself very lucky because I saw like literally saw lots and lots of violence on Rikers Island. Uh,
What was the
you
worst thing
know,
you ever saw?
well, I mean, and the worst thing, and it was the common thing, was people getting slashed like with razors, right? People that was the weapon of choice for some. Some people would have other like makeshift weapons and would stab people. You got to remember that. So I don't know how it is now. Like I said, this is all those years ago. But when you got arrested, you kept your clothes. You came onto Rikers Island with your clothes, and so some people, including myself, I had a fight over my clothes, my sneakers, stuff like that. So especially if you are as we used to say, hustling, right? So you're making fast money. And so you sometimes may come in with jewelry, right? You may like diamonds or gold and all sorts of other, expensive sneakers and coats, whatever, stuff like that. When you come in, people are like they were on you, like on you. Like if you didn't know anybody, you weren't established. As soon as people would come in, I would see them um some of the people who consider themselves um I don't know what they called it, but they thought they ran the house, ran the dorm, right? And they would just go up and approach the person and literally sometimes just start like taking stuff off, like they're gonna relieve them of it. It was that crazy. It was like, okay, yeah, I'll take this. And then, often the guy, people would fight for this stuff, and then get jumped. And then other times people would not even resist because they was just too afraid. So, and then if they did resist, um, and sometimes even if they didn't, a person would cut them first to instill fear, right? So then the person would then not want to fight, not want to, resist, So it was crazy. I was like, this is madness. And this was like very common. I was, like I said, 16 going on 17. And adolescents are the worst, right? It's not like somebody in their 30s, 40s, maybe who either had done time on Rikers Island, so they kind of knew the ropes, so to speak, like how to navigate the craziness, or someone who just even if it was their first time, they were older, maybe they had jobs, they worked, they were law, but whatever, and got caught up in a situation. Because you got to remember, everyone who's on Rikers Island, especially as detainees, they're not necessarily guilty,
Right.
just because you got arrested. Yeah, so you got all sorts of people in there. So it was crazy, but I saw a lot of violence, and I couldn't wait to get out of there.
And you eventually though complete that 4 month sentence and
So I got arrested, and I still remember January 12th, 1987, and was released May 15th of 1987. My birthday's in April, so I turned 17 on Rikers Island, and I also earned my GED while Rikers Island. So I was always a good student, and it's a good thing at that time they required adolescents to go to school. So I took advantage of it. Some of my peers, they hung out, they acting tough, all this other stuff. I wanted to, I saw it as an opportunity to go to school, to get my GED, and not lose too much time as far as school, because I was in 11th grade when I got arrested. So yeah, so the first time I took it, I passed it, got out in May, was on probation for some time, for 5 years actually, and went to, let me say, 87, and then in early 89 I went to college upstate New York. So yeah, so that's how it all began.
oh, so you were like going to college, like and you pretty much were you're on a straight and narrow path, like what did you do after college?
So I was on probation, right? Like I said, first. and then I got a job in the city. Like I said, I live in Manhattan now, but I lived in Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn, and so I worked a messenger job. Back then, messenger jobs were a really big deal. Like how you see now, like in the city now, we see a lot of people with the electric bikes for
Right.
like food delivery and stuff like that. Back then, we didn't have. Or you didn't see the electric bikes. I had my own, regular like 10 speed or 12 speed bike. Uh, Left it at work and at the office in Manhattan, and then would have different assignments. And I made pretty good money as an 18-year-old. So I did that for about a year or so. Then went up to college in upstate New York,
What
and
were you studying?
it was what was it? It was general studies. It was they called it general studies, so that would be similar to like a liberal arts, like a
Right, right.
liberal arts major. Now my goal though was to be, like I said, to be a pilot, right? They didn't have a flight program, but the school had I think it was what they call an A&P, uh, like I don't know, degree program. A&P stands for airframe and power plant, right? So it's like mechanical stuff. So I never went that route because I've never been like mechanically inclined. But I was like, oh, that's close enough. And even though I didn't pursue that, the fact that they had it, if I wanted to, at least the way I told, yeah, rationalize it, is that if I decide to change my mind and pursue the mechanical, part of aviation, then at least it was there. And I actually went to that school. It was not my first choice. The school I wanted to go to is in Daytona Beach, Florida, right? It's called
Beth University?
Embry-Riddle.
Oh, Embry-Riddle
No,
Aeronautical. Yeah.
yeah, Aeronautical University. Yes, exactly. And so that was my dream, Like I knew about it from when in high school. I actually used to take, before I got in trouble with the law, I actually took flying lessons at Park West High School in Manhattan. So we would go out to Farmingdale University in Long Island, took flying lessons, and I was like, oh, I'm actually living my dream. This is, I'm on the path. And then, like I said, crack just took over the neighborhood by storm and just derailed everything for me, as a teenager. And so I, how you say it? I got like college catalogs and stuff like that from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. They sent me materials, looked at the tuition, and it was like just too high. It was a private school, right? Flying lessons on top of tuition and all that. And my father, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't grow up with my father, I grew up with my mom. Meanwhile, my mom is abusing drugs and was not around a lot, right? So we were living with my grandmother. My mom would um, be like in the next building or whatever. In other words, she wasn't like in another part of town, but she wasn't raising us, right? As she once did prior to her addiction to crack. And so I say all that to say that I didn't know how to navigate the whole college situation. I didn't have examples
You didn't have any
in my
guidance.
family.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had no guidance at all. Meanwhile, my father, I mean, they both have passed away since then, was a college graduate, was a pilot at one time, and did so many other things, but he was too busy, right? Every time I would call him, it was like he had something else to do. And then he had a whole bunch of children, right? And so I just didn't have that type of support. And so I say that to say, so I was discouraged from uh, pursuing Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I didn't know how to do it. I just didn't. I had no idea. I didn't know who to turn to. So a friend of mine at the time, he mentioned the school that was upstate New York, and we were just looking at some of the SUNY schools, State University of New York, and so yeah, I kind of like followed him. I was like, okay, yeah, I'll go because I knew I wanted out of the city.
Right,
Right, it
right.
was just crazy. So I wasn't beyond that. There wasn't a lot more planning, to be honest. We filled out the applications with the help of his mom, my friend's mom, and got accepted. And then we were off. We went 5 hours away from New York City.
So it seems like that this would be like the end of the story, that you got on this straight path, you went to college, like you start working. How do you end up getting incarcerated again?
Yeah, so I did not. I wish it were a straight and narrow path. It was not. So I went to college, just spring semester of 1989. So I was 18, going on 19, because again, my birthday is in April. and we started school in January. Um, I went for the first semester after, and to be honest, I like when I look back now, I was not prepared. I was not prepared. I didn't have the discipline. I lacked the discipline to really focus on school. One, like I said, I had my girlfriend, I had my siblings who were home, like back in Brooklyn, and my mom's, on drugs. So all that stuff was playing in the back of my mind while I was in school. And then, although it was a community college, it was it was a new world for me, living in the dorms with other college students from all over the country, different races, ethnicity. So it was, all of that. And I got distracted with, I did go to class. I did go to class initially, but then I got distracted with partying, right? They had a lot of cake parties and other parties. And I did, uh, got involved with some of that. And so I think slowly but surely I started losing my way. And again, I didn't know who to turn to. Now I do realize now they had advisors on campus and things like that, but I didn't, avail myself of those. I just told myself like, I'm smart. You'll figure this out. You'll get it, or whatever. And then after the first semester, I went back home. Uh, and I hadn't seen my girlfriend at the time for some time. She, so we saw each other. She ended up getting pregnant. Uh, and that changed everything because now I'm like, okay, now we have a baby on the way. And uh, so I ended up going back to school after that summer break, going back in the fall of 1989. But then I really couldn't concentrate now because I said to myself, I want to be a better father than my father was to me. I want to be, present. I want to be, um, contribute, in other words, financially, do my part. And so I ended up leaving school in, I believe, November, early November. So school started in late August of '89. I stayed for about 2 months, like September and October. And then November, and that was hard because I really, really, really wanted to make something of myself and change the trajectory of my family's life. Right? Uh, but I left school, dropped out, and said I got to get a job because I'm like, she was like 5 months pregnant or something like that, and I'm like, we got a baby on the way. I gotta go home and provide for my family. So I left school, stayed with my girlfriend's and her mom at the time because my family had by then had moved down south. One of my aunts, it was a crazy time, as probably recall. Not only was it the height of the crack era, but it was also the AIDS epidemic.
Right.
And so one of my aunts contracted AIDS, and that was new. We was like, what, like what the hell is this? But she had the visible signs of being sick. And so she, like my mom, was born in the South, so she knew she was going. She knew she was going. The family knew she was going. And so she wanted to be buried down South. And so the whole family at that time, I think for whatever reason, they all just decided to leave. And so meanwhile, I'm up in New York with my girlfriend's family, basically. Um, and so I ended up, to answer your question, I started getting desperate at some point, right? I ended up working. I worked a little bit when I first came back from college back to the city because I'm like, okay, I got to make money for my family, got to save up, get ready. And so I worked for a little bit, but this is like I said, it was basically I think the minimum wage was like $3.35 or something crazy like that, and I'm like, okay, this is not gonna get it.
Right.
So and I'm not proud of this, but I did in my mind tell myself, okay, if I don't get a decent paying job soon, I'm gonna go back to quote unquote what I know, right, which is robbing, right? I mean, I wouldn't have done it by myself, but I would go back to my old neighborhood and say, hey, let's do this. So that was my thinking. I didn't want to do it, but that was my thinking. I didn't do it, but I certainly it crossed my mind. So I spoke to one of my friends who I left in college, who I had met in college, and And so I called, just called up there one day. It was like, hey, what are you guys up to? Blah, blah, blah. And they said that they were dealing drugs, right? That they were selling. And so, and they were like, what's going on with you? And I was like, I got the baby on the way, this and that, man. I'm getting desperate. I don't know what to do. I'm about to commit some crime. I got to get some money. And they were like, oh, you can come up here, right? And this is where I was going to school, but now they're off campus. This is not all of my friends, but some of them had some hookup and they were making money. And so they said, yeah, you can come up here. And I said, well, um, basically that sounds like that works for me. And they was telling me like the types of money or the amounts of money that they were making. I had um prior to leaving school, I had filled out credit card applications, right? While in school. And one of them came back, right? And so I got my first credit card, meaning one of the credit cards, one of the ones that I applied for came back. It was some MasterCard, I forgot which one, but so anyway, I still remember it was like $500 or $600 credit limit. That was a lifesaver for me back then, right? I'm not proud of it. It's just part of my story. I took the money. I bought some maternity clothes for my girlfriend at the time, and then I took some other money. I was in Harlem, and it's easy to find stuff. So I took money cash out actually, which is a terrible thing to do. I realize now, but I took cash out, cash advance, and bought drugs. Bought some drugs, and so initially. Um, I went around my old neighborhood to try to sell it. But I hadn't been out there in a while. People who were much more established, you can't just like walk into an area and just start selling drugs. That's you can easily get killed or hurt that way, right? So I felt like, okay, this is dangerous, right? Like I'm not really from around here anymore. At least it felt that way. And so when I spoke to my friends who were in school, I told them that I had some, like a couple of, ironically enough, crack vials left, and so I ended up taking, bringing it up there. It sold out right away, and I became addicted to the lifestyle right away. So it was. I mean, the money was fast at some point, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, but here I am 19, 20, 21. There were days when I made two, three, even $4,000 a day. And this was 30 something years ago. So it was hard for me. And as it was hard for me to leave the lifestyle. I wanted to. I mean, I really did want to. But I didn't like. My thinking was, okay, I'm a college dropout, right? Smart person, but a college dropout. What are my options? Like, how can I see money like this? I would not have been able to see it, but unless if I knew about entrepreneurship back then that would have been different. But I didn't know, so
Man, and
yeah.
um, you have like such a compelling story, and you've written this book, Think Outside the Stale. I'm here with Joe Robinson. Can you tell me, like, what was the inspiration behind the book?
So the inspiration was one, I was incarcerated. A big part that I left out is that so in 19, without getting into too many details, in 1991, I got into an altercation while upstate, where I was selling drugs, and got into an altercation with a guy who thought that I had someone had months earlier had tried to rob him, right? Like in broad day, like at a bar. And he thought I had something to do with it because I was from the city. Right. He was like, no, I know you had something to do with it. So he threatened me and said that the next time he saw me, he would get me or whatever. And then so I got into an altercation and and ended up taking his life. I'm not gonna say, that wasn't the plan, but he had a weapon. I disarmed him and used it and ran and they got the weapon, obviously because I didn't, like I said, it wasn't mine. I didn't intend to, do any harm, anything like that. So I ended up, I was on the run. And so I did run out of the place. I was on the run for about 5 months in New York City, got arrested in Brooklyn. I was taken upstate and was sentenced to 25 to life, believe it or not. Um, and ended up serving 24 and a half years. So I've been home 7 years. While inside, early on, we talking 93, 94, 95. Early on, I began to really think about why I was there, like what was going on with me and all of that in terms of me keep getting in trouble and just um yeah, and I knew that prison was not for me, right? Like it was just clear. It's like I'm here, but I'm not with this. This is not what I saw for myself, for my life, and this is not what my mother, prior to her addiction, she had, and even afterwards, would always tell me how smart I was, how I was very capable, doing whatever I put my mind to. So that stayed with me, and so I ended up, so I started reading books about personal finance and entrepreneurship early on. So I was like 24, 25. I started investing while I was in prison at 24 years old. And then years later, the next year, in 1995, I was only 25, but I started teaching classes. I taught my first class in 1995 on investing, right? What stocks are, what are bonds, mutual funds, and all that stuff. And I'd never turned back since. I love to teach, and it was